Okay, you guys, welcome back to part two. So, we left off discussing the Zimmerman telegram and the United States entering World War One. So, just for a tiny bit of recap. So, the United States, or World War One, begins in 1914. The United States initially has a position of neutrality. A year after the war begins in 1915, towards the end of 1915, the United States kind of shifts its position to one of preparedness. So we're not starting the war, we're not entering the war, rather, but we are going to be prepared for for anything that could happen. And so you see an expansion of both the Army and the Navy by late 1915. The United States does not officially enter World War One until 1917, when, after the Zimmerman telegram is found, Woodrow Wilson will ask the United States, or ask Congress rather, for a declaration of war. Now, one thing that I did not go after or go over is that um, Woodrow Wilson is reelected in this time, and his campaign slogan, ironically, is "He kept us out of war." And so he's reelected really with this idea and this kind of congratulatory fervor that says Woodrow Wilson has kept us out of war. And then he's reelected, and we go into war. We enter World War One. Now, the statement of American war aims and the vision of a new international order is known as the 14 points. So, what are the key principles of the 14 points? Why are we entering this war? Well, one, there's this idea that we want self determination for all nations. Two, freedom of the seas. There had not been any freedom of the seas because, remember, due to submarine warfare, Germany began to sink ships even if you didn't have anything to do with the actual war effort. Another one of the 14 points is free trade as well as open diplomacy. So, an end to any treaties that are signed or done in secret. There is also this belief that colonized people should be given equal weight in deciding their own futures. And in the 14 points, it also speaks of the creation of a, quote, general association of nations to preserve international peace. Now, when we are in war, war often creates a pretty heavy sense of patriotism, and we see this in World War One. We've seen it. We'll see it again in World War Two, and really any other war that the United States is in. War creates patriotism. Now, in order to shore up the Navy and the Army, the Selective Service Act is signed into practice. So, the Selective Service Act required about 24 million men to register with the draft. So, if you were between the ages of 21 and 30, prime fighting ages, you were required to sign up for the draft. A lot of our federal industries, a lot of our industries is transportation, labor, a lot of those things will pivot, and the government will begin to regulate these industries, and they'll regulate transportation and labor relations in agriculture in order to really prepare for the war effort. When this happens, it leads to higher wages, better working conditions, and honestly, more union membership. It's also during this time that we get the suspension of antitrust laws. So, if you remember the Sherman antitrust law, that prevented any combination of practices that would restrict free trade. During this time, however, since the government is kind of taking over a lot of these industries, antitrust laws are suspended during this time. Now, because of all the patriotism going on, a lot of progressives feel that the war could give society the chance to reform itself, right? So, progressives and a lot of reformists at this time really believe that society is capable of perfection, that it's capable of infinite improvement. And so progressives really see the opportunity for society to kind of remake itself and become better. Now, even though the United States has officially joined the war effort, a lot of Americans are still pretty skeptical about entering this conflict because the idea is that we're entering a conflict between rival empires and it really doesn't have much to do with us. And so a lot of Americans are pretty skeptical. And this skepticism can hurt the war effort because patriotism is really like the blood, right? Patriotism is the blood of the work ethic, or I'm sorry, of the war effort. You have to have patriotism in order for any war effort to be successful. In any event, if you have any war and the people, the nation is no longer behind you, you're not going to win that war. Patriotism is vital to the war effort. So, in order to increase patriotism, in order to really expose Americans to this patriotic fervor, I'll call it, the Committee on Public Information, or the CPI, again, the Committee on Public Information, or the CPI, is created in April 1917. So, right after we enter the war, the CPI is created. And the purpose of the CPI is to A, explain the war to Americans in a way that is very digestible, in a way that is easy to understand, and in a way that will be create a wave of patriotism among the people. So the CPI will flood the country with pro-war propaganda. Since Americans are still pretty skeptical, you have to kind of change their minds about the war effort. You want them to want to be excited for this war. And so instead of this war being framed as a war between rival empires, instead it's framed as a war that is being fought for the great cause of freedom. Doesn't that sound much better, right? It's harder, I'll say, to get people excited if you think that the war is against nations that you don't have anything to do with. Instead, this war is being fought, quote, for the great cause of freedom. And so it gets people very excited about the war effort. So, again, if you're in my class that's being taught this spring, 2021, one thing that I'll have you guys read is an editorial that W.E.B. Du Bois writes for the NAACP's monthly magazine called The Crisis. And so, even W.E.B. Du Bois, who we'll talk about later in this chapter, who speaks a lot about the injustices that African Americans are facing in the United States at this time, even he will get kind of swept up in the cause of the war effort. And even he will encourage African Americans to join the war and to support the war and to join the draft. I have a few propaganda posters that are in the presentation. And again, that's if you're in my class, they will be in an assignment. And one of these, you really get to see how the nation is really flooding this pro war, or how the government is really flooding the nation with pro war propaganda. On one of these posters, the Statue of Liberty, with kind of this grimace on her face, is like, "You buy a Liberty bond, lest I perish." So if you don't support the war effort in this way, you are putting liberty at risk. Okay? Now, it's also during this time that the war for freedom will inspire demands for freedom at home. And so, when we talk about the war, it's kind of impossible to talk about it without talking about women. Women at this time have been fighting for decades for the right to vote. A lot of women, because they're looking at how can you fight a war for freedom if you don't truly have freedom at home? And so the war will inspire a lot of demands for social, personal, economic freedom. A lot of women will join the war movement, and they'll do so in any way that they can. Women will sell war bonds, they will organize patriotic rallies, as well as work in production jobs that have been vacated by men. Now, a lot of you have heard of Rosie the Riveter. However, Rosie the Riveter is not of this era, okay? Rosie the Riveter does not come up until World War II. Okay. But also during that time or during World War One, we like to think that women would go to work during World War II, but women also went to work during World War One. So because of technical difficulties, I'll have to freeze and come back with part three.